Hey folks, this is Rhykker, and a war is currently being waged over the future of the monetization of video games. And the battlefront for that war is... It's Battlefront 2. Now, when we first started covering this topic in last week's video, we discussed the outrage surrounding Star Wars Battlefront 2's grindy microtransaction loot box system. And we spoke about the tiny glimpse of victory that we had in the form of EA lowering the prices to unlock heroes. Now, I caution against considering this to be too much of a victory. EA simply ceded a small amount of territory in order to secure the greater victory in the end. But still, it was a mostly symbolic victory for gamers because it proved that us making noise about this issue was eliciting a response from EA. But that wasn't the only response. Since my video, we prompted the developers of Battlefront to host an Ask Me Anything on Reddit to respond to questions. We made enough noise to get the mainstream media's attention. We got investors worried and concerned about EA's stock. And we even got gambling commissions to start looking closer into whether or not loot boxes need to be regulated. And the latest news in that regard, which we'll cover a little bit later in the video, is some very early signs towards EA having potentially ruined loot boxes for the entire video game industry. But more on that in a bit. Now we're going to cover in depth all the topics that I just brought up. I've wanted to get an update video out earlier than this, but the story just kept developing, and I've got up to now like 22 pages of notes on this. So this is going to be a very deep video, but I'm going to try to get through it as succinctly as possible. But the first thing that I need to mention before we really dive into this is something that I mentioned in our first video on the topic, in which EA developers were getting death threats because of this controversy. This was sort of the one bit of moral high ground that EA could stand upon, the one thing sort of victimizing them and making us feel bad for them. Well, after some excellent investigative journalism by Kotaku, it turns out that the guy who was allegedly receiving the death threats didn't even work for EA. He was just a big fat phony. Alright, let's dive right into this now, starting with the premature victory. After all the outrage, after we made all this noise, after mainstream started to cover things, after Disney probably started putting pressure on EA, it was late last week that we got word that EA, or DICE, the developer of Battlefront 2, would be removing microtransactions from the game. The official EA Star Wars Twitter account tweeted, "Today we turned off in-game purchases for Star Wars Battlefront 2." And they attached an image of a full statement from the general manager at DICE, Oscar Gabrielson. To skip past the empty talk, we get to, quote, "We hear you loud and clear, so we're turning off all in-game purchases." So that's a win, right? Mission accomplished? That's what some of us were prematurely thinking, and that's exactly what EA wanted us to think. But it's only a couple lines later down in that message that Gabrielson goes on to say, "The ability to purchase crystals in-game will become available at a later date, only after we've made changes to the game." In other words, there's no intention of permanently removing microtransactions. They are definitely coming back. And it's pretty transparent that the reason for this decision was to temporarily appease consumers so that we can now buy the game, and then, once the controversy has died down, they can bring back the microtransactions. They're just trying to give consumers a reason to buy the game. Say, okay, it's alright, no more microtransactions, I'm allowed to buy the game now. No more boycotting, right? And the sad truth is that to some extent this worked. Some people bought into this, not realizing that microtransactions weren't removed. They were just put on pause. Now the statement is that they're going to find some way of changing the game or the microtransaction system before bringing the system back in, and we do have some idea of how they will be reintroduced, thanks to an industry insider who leaked some information. More on that in a bit. But even without that leak, we did have some indication of a route that DICE may take with the revised monetization system. Before the monetization system was taken offline, DICE held an Ask Me Anything on Reddit where they replied to some questions that consumers had about the game. This was a PR stunt done in response to the outrage to serve as some form of damage control. From the Ask Me Anything, we learned that the developers are working on cosmetic customization in Battlefront 2, and games like Overwatch have proven that if there's one form of loot box system that people will accept, it's if it's purely cosmetic microtransactions. We also learned that the matchmaking system should allegedly keep things fair and balanced with regards to the whole pay-to-win thing. In other words, if you have items that give you an advantage over other players, then you should only be matched with other players of similar skill or ability or power. Whether we believe or trust that statement is another story, and we do have reason to not believe what the developers say, which we'll get to in a little bit here, because they have lied or misled us before. We saw lots and lots and lots of talk about the developers always looking over data and tweaking numbers, and perhaps the meatiest answer that we received was about the game's arcade mode. Quote, "With Arcade, we set out to let players earn credits offline via a more relaxed game mode, but as a result, we needed to make sure it wouldn't be exploited in a way that would impact multiplayer. So to stop this potential for abuse, we decided to place a limit on credits earned offline." Okay, so you don't want multiplayer impacted by any potential exploits of people getting too many credits, too many rewards from playing offline. So it stands to reason then that you would also limit the number of loot boxes that you can purchase, right? So that it's not going to affect the multiplayer experience? Oh no, of course not. You're fine with exploitation as long as it's exploiting consumers' wallets. Pay to exploit is fine, but we can't have any of those free exploits. No, no, no. And another statement made was, quote, "Ultimately your effectiveness is going to come down to skill, not the star cards, items, that you have." Now, we'll revisit this statement in a moment, but he's basically saying the game is not pay to win, and others disagree. Now, ultimately, this Ask Me Anything was a PR stunt and nothing more. We did not get any concrete answers on important issues beyond we're looking into numbers and looking to make changes, which is a statement that did not require an Ask Me Anything to make. Now, on the topic of pay to win, this was not the first time that one of the game's developers came out and said that the game will not be pay to win. In a GameSpot article published in June, design director Nicholas Fegraus had assured fans that Battlefront 2 will not allow players to pay to win. Quote, "No, it's not about buying the winning item. That's not how it works. No one can say, I'm gonna spend my zillion dollars and then I'm going to dominate. That's not how it works." Fast forward a few months to release, and we have players digging into the game and some very much disagreeing about the game being pay to win. We have this video here from X Factor Gaming showing some Boba Fett gameplay, first with no star cards whatsoever, no items, in which he's clearly underwhelmed with the naked Boba Fett, and then he spends a bunch of money to deck out his character in very strong items or star cards, and then he's just gleefully giggling at how powerful he is, and he very much gets the impression that it is pay to win. Then we have this video from Level Cap Gaming. In a review of the game, he explains how much of an advantage he had over other players by spending around $100 on loot crates. There's one mode in this game that allows you to fly spaceships, and with star cards in his A-Wing fighter, he's able to turn 20% faster, and he says, quote, "I'm pretty much the fastest thing on the field." Beyond that, he has a faster firing rate, more damage per shot, which all translates into about 30 to 40% more damage altogether. Now, to be fair, he did have to put in about 20 hours in order to be able to upgrade his star cards, in order to be able to effectively have this level of gear. Basically, EA at some point implemented a system in which you had to at least work a bit for your power. You can't just instantly unlock it with money at level 1. You have to put some time investment before you gain access to the power that you could pay for. However, Level Cap Gaming states that he would not have been able to get these best-in-slot items as soon as he did without forking over money, and therefore paying still gave him a considerable advantage over other players. If there's any doubt whatsoever as to how much star cards could really impact your performance, there's literally a star card that helps with aim assist. Now, the Battlefront controversy has actually been going on for many weeks. It just hasn't blown up quite as much as it had in the past week. And thanks to initial complaints, endgame tier, the best star cards can no longer be acquired from loot crates. In the past, you could directly get those best items from loot crates, so you can just keep buying loot crates until you have all the best gear. Now you have to actually craft them. While this seems like a solution to the issue, crafting materials are obtained through loot boxes. So instead of paying money to get the best item from a loot box, you're paying money to get the crafting materials to make yourself the best item. And Reddit user The Hotter Potato ran the math, and it takes approximately 24 hours of gameplay or $20 of microtransactions to craft the highest level of star card. So I don't know about you folks, but to me, I'm starting to feel like I'm being lied to when the developers keep insisting that there are no pay-to-win elements in this game. And to pile onto that, in a message sent to players after the beta, posted on the official website, we have this message, quote, "If you get a duplicate star card in a crate, you will get crafting parts, which you can then use to help upgrade the star card of your choice." But what players are realizing now that the game released is that that's not true at all. If you get a duplicate item, instead of getting crafting parts, you're getting credits. In other words, instead of getting crafting materials in order to craft whatever you want, you're getting credits so that you can buy more loot boxes to maybe get what you want. Now, duplicates are a real problem in loot box systems. And when we talk about duplicates, we mean that if you get an item from a loot box and it's sort of an unlock, it's something that you get once, and if you were to get that same thing another time, you just can't have it twice. For instance, if you unlock a skin, you can't unlock a skin a second time. Therefore, it counts as a duplicate and it is of zero worth to you. So the reason that duplicates become a problem is that in a game in which there are many potential items to get, the more you unlock, the more difficult it becomes to get the remaining items. You're just getting more and more duplicates. And the biggest issue right now with the Battlefront 2 duplicate system is that if you get a loot box of mostly duplicates, you actually end up at a deficit. The amount of credits that you spend to get the loot box turns out to being more than the amount of credits you receive from all those dupes. Now, does that sound like a familiar system at all? A system in which you insert some money for a random chance to get something and generally end up with less money than you started? Now, Overwatch is a game that had a big problem with duplicates in its cosmetic loot boxes, but it resolved that issue by tweaking the numbers such that you were a lot less likely to get a duplicate item. But in Overwatch, there is no system to buy loot boxes with credits. So once you open a loot box and you have duplicates, which again now is pretty rare, you'll get coins, and those coins are always more than you put in because you can't put in any coins to open a loot box. But in Battlefront, you can. So it literally eventually devolves into a slot machine. Now, I know we've had some debates over whether or not loot boxes are gambling, but when it gets to that point, that's about as literal as gambling as we could get. The only way to not end up at a credit deficit is by spending real money on loot boxes. Oh, and if you want another example of the devs either lying or being dishonest or just misleading us, remember how they said in the Ask Me Anything that if you play arcade mode offline, you get credits at a reduced rate? It turns out if you play with no internet connection, that reduced rate is 0 credits ever. Yes, by offline mode, they don't literally mean offline, they just mean not multiplayer. If your internet goes down, no credits for you. So we've discussed the importance of these star cards, of items. We've touched upon credit acquisition rates, and a few diligent people have done some really great analyses of the numbers to try to add some perspective to this whole discussion. According to Soren Camper of Star Wars Strategies.com, in order to unlock everything, we're talking about all the star card stuff here, it would require over 4,500 hours of gameplay, or $2,100. And according to Reddit user HNK, the most efficient way to progress in Battlefront 2 is to work even a minimum wage job. In fact, you can work less than minimum wage. You can almost work at sweatshop rates. HNK calculated that all you need to earn is more than 80 cents an hour, and earning that amount of money and spending it on loot boxes will make you progress faster than just playing the game. His calculations state that playing Battlefield 2 for 40 hours, 40, will earn you $32 worth of loot boxes. Now, even if rewards were doubled, or tripled, or even quadrupled, you'd still progress faster with a minimum wage job. But of course, you would lack the sense of pride and accomplishment, which is priceless. To make matters even worse, there are reports that rewards in this game are front-loaded. In other words, progression is fast at the start, but then it slows down after a couple dozen hours invested into the game, eventually slowing to a crawl. We've got reports of people with 25 to 50 hours in the game getting MVP every match and hardly getting any credits. In other words, the game hooks you into this reward system, gets you invested into the game. After a couple dozen hours, you're pretty hooked. And that's when that principle of ego depletion starts to set in that we discussed in our previous video. All of a sudden, it's taking so long to progress, and it's so inviting to just buy that next loot box. Now, I really wish I can say that this was the first time that EA has ever done anything so seemingly underhanded. But you really don't have to dig far to find examples of EA doing things that are clearly not in the interest of the gamer. For instance, back in 2004, EA worked out an exclusivity deal with the NFL. You see, back in the day, there used to be two major competing football franchises, EA's Madden series and 2K's ESPN NFL 2K series. These two franchises were major competitors, and the 2K series was met with critical acclaim over 6 games before that exclusivity deal was signed in 2004. This shut down 2K series altogether, making Madden's the only NFL series left. And since then, the Madden series has gotten lower review scores on average than it used to. It's almost as if competition is a good thing that forces you to make a better product. EA tried to work out a similar deal with the NBA, because 2K also had a rival NBA series that was a lot more successful than EA's, but the NBA didn't go for that deal. Another time EA did something kinda scummy was when they fired one of the original creators of Plants vs. Zombies, George Fan, because he refused to include pay-to-win elements in Plants vs. Zombies 2. He replied to rumors about this with this tweet: "Regarding recent rumors, it is true I was laid off by EA/PopCap, and also true that I was against making PvZ2 a freemium game. That's all I'll say on the matter for now." But perhaps the saddest thing here is that what they're doing with Battlefront 2 is something that they've been doing with other games for a while now. For players of EA's FIFA 18, Battlefront 2 system is just the norm. FIFA 18 has a pay-to-win mode, and other things are seen in other recent EA games as well. In sports games and racing games, it seems these models are just accepted. But Battlefront 2 reaches a wider audience. Don't get me wrong, there's a huge audience for sports and racing games, but those audiences are generally different from the kind of gamer that plays World of Warcraft or Diablo or Overwatch. Now, over the years, publishers have been slowly introducing more and more ways to squeeze money from us. And honestly, Battlefront 2's system isn't so far out of the norm that it would be a complete shock, but it seems that this is finally the straw to break the camel's back. We've been heading towards a tipping point where at some point, gamers would say enough is enough, and it seems we have now reached that point. And it is thanks to the huge amount of noise that the gaming community has been making over this that mainstream media has caught the story and has started to spread it. And it's as mainstream media started to pick up this story that the narrative started to shift towards associating the names Disney and EA with gambling. There was a point last week that on Twitter, if you searched #gambling, the top 2 results were EA Games and Disney. The controversy made the front page of CNN's tech section. The UK's Daily Mirror covered it. It made it onto Canadian national news. We've had reports of local news outlets from around the world covering the story. CNBC reported that even Wall Street was getting worried that social media outrage over EA's Star Wars game may hurt sales. They also reported that in a note to clients, the Bank of America said, "We see recent controversies as a potential risk for unit sales." We saw the BBC report on the controversy and the removal of the microtransaction system without buying into EA's narrative and clearly stating that the system will return, that its removal was just temporary. The Washington Post outright asked EA if players can be guaranteed that pay-to-win mechanics have been removed from the game, and EA just dodged the question. So all of a sudden, this wasn't just a discussion amongst gamers, or just on Reddit, or just on YouTube. This is something that moms and dads were hearing about. Bankers, investors, government representatives. And all of this ruckus led the Belgian Commission for Gambling to open an investigation into Battlefront 2 and also Overwatch's loot boxes. Because according to the Gaming Commission, such a game is primarily a danger for minors, who spend a lot of money under social pressure. And the result of this investigation, in a worst case scenario, or I suppose a best case scenario for us, would lead to EA either having to spend hundreds of thousands of euros as a fine, or having the game removed from shelves altogether. So after Belgium started this investigation into gambling, EA made a statement to GameSpot basically saying, no, it's not gambling, it's not gambling. Quote, "The crate mechanics are not gambling. A player's ability to succeed in the game is not dependent on purchasing crates. Players can also earn crates through playing the game and not spending any money at all. Once obtained, players are always guaranteed to receive content that can be used in-game." Now that last point has been the one major technicality that has made loot boxes not fit the legal definition of gambling, that you're always guaranteed to get something. If you could get nothing at all, then it would be gambling. But Belgium has its own regulations, and the Belgium Gaming Act of May 7th, 1999 defines games of chance as, quote, "any game by which a stake of any kind is committed, the consequence of which is either loss of the stake by at least one of the players, or a gain of any kind in favor of at least one of the players, or organizers of the game in which chance is a factor, albeit ancillary, for the conduct of the game, determination of the winner, or fixing of the gain." And it's this week that we got a ruling from Belgium that yes, it is gambling. The gambling committee said mixing money and addiction is gambling. And there's plenty of proof of people getting addicted to loot boxes, to those kind of microtransactions in games. The Belgian Minister of Justice wants to prohibit purchases in video games if you do not know what exactly you are getting with that purchase. And he doesn't want this to apply just to Belgium, but to all of Europe as well. And it would seem other countries are also starting to get behind this. A French senator, for instance, Jérôme Zurin, wrote a letter to France's online gambling authority. In this letter, he starts by praising video games as a positive contribution to the country, then points out that many gamers have concerns about the negative effects that loot box microtransactions can have on the industry. He questions whether there should be some consumer protection in place. He points out that cosmetic loot boxes are well accepted by the community, but that pay-to-win loot boxes, as seen in Battlefront 2, which he specifies by name, have caused much debate and have drawn many comparisons to gambling. He points out that there isn't much transparency when it comes to loot box statistics outside of China, which a short time ago established regulation that all loot box probabilities must be made public. And Zurin questions whether France should do the same. We also have some good news happening in America. Hawaiian State Representative Chris Lee put out this YouTube video right here.
We are here today to ensure future protections for kids, youth, and everyone when it comes to the spread of predatory practices in online gaming and the significant financial consequences that it can have on families and has been having on families around this nation. This game is a Star Wars themed online casino designed to lure kids into spending money. It's a trap. And this is something that we need to address to ensure that particularly kids who are underage, who are not psychologically and emotionally mature enough to be able to gamble, which is why gambling is prohibited under 21, are protected from being trapped into these cycles, which have compelled many folks to spend thousands of dollars in gaming fees online. We're looking at legislation this coming year which could prohibit access or prohibit the sale of these games to folks who are underage in order to protect families, as well as prohibiting different kinds of mechanisms in those games. We've been talking with several other states as well, legislators there who are looking at the same thing. I think this is an appropriate time to make sure that these issues are addressed before this becomes the new norm for every game.
And in a follow-up Reddit post, he went on to state, "You can compel action wherever you live by calling and emailing your own state legislators and asking them to act. But don't stop there. Call your allies, call your pastors and teachers and community leaders. Ask them to call your state legislators as well. Their voices are politically powerful." He goes on to say, "And frankly, we don't need to change the laws in every state. We just need to change a few, and it will be enough to draw the line and compel change. I mean, think about it. If game developers have to start worrying about, okay, in these states I have to release this version of the game, and in these states I can release the other version of the game, and how is the community going to react to this, and how do I connect the communities, it's going to be way too much of a headache. Chris Lee concluded by saying, your future is whatever you make it, so make it a good one. You have the power to get involved and decide this, and the choice is clear. Stand up now, or let this be the new normal from this point forward. Additionally, for whatever it's worth, there's a petition to the ESRB to declare loot boxes as gambling. It has over 80,000 signatures as of now. I'll put a link to that in the description below. And it seems all this talk about gambling, all of this outrage, all of this association with the Star Wars brand and negative press and gambling all happening right before the release of The Last Jedi has not made Disney very happy. Now, last week there was a rumor that was started about EA being threatened with losing their exclusivity deal they have with Disney for making Star Wars games unless they remove or revamp their microtransaction system. We heard from a Reddit user named Cravguy who seemed to have inside knowledge. In order to not be fired, he didn't give too many details about his identity, but before EA disabled microtransactions, he made this statement. EA was just threatened with losing their exclusivity deal unless they revamp/remove the current microtransaction system. He said the announcement will either be coming tonight or tomorrow. Watch Twitter and the forums. And as he predicted within his time frame, the microtransaction system was taken down, which gives legitimacy to his claim of being an insider. He went on to say that Disney is a company that's taken a strong stance against gambling, and is angry that gambling-related bad press has begun to affect the company's public image and the public image of the Star Wars intellectual property. They're particularly upset that it's happening right before the release of the new movie. Now, of course, this does not 100% confirm that this is an industry insider. It could just be a lucky guess, but his comments about the specificity of the message that we ended up getting and the time frame under which we received that message do lend him legitimacy. So what he went on to tell us about what's going on inside EA's headquarters was that microtransactions will be reintroduced, and that there are two options currently on the table as to how that will happen. The first being that microtransactions will be cosmetic only. He specifies that this is a less popular option for EA and will only happen if we continue to make enough noise. Because the second system is that microtransactions will be used to purchase specific star card and cosmetic packages or bundles. This is so that the gambling aspect is removed, but it still will be paid to win. He goes on to say that really the only reason any of this is happening is because of how much noise we've been making, and he encourages us to keep making noise. He went on to say that Disney is unhappy with how long it took EA to take effective action on this matter. They're upset that EA allowed the situation, the bad press, to evolve to its current state, which is a state that could harm Disney's brand and the Star Wars brand. And this sentiment was corroborated by reputable journalist Ben Fritz, who tweeted that Disney's CEO was upset about the Battlefront 2 microtransaction debacle, and another Disney exec, Jimmy Pitaro, expressed Disney's displeasure to EA. According to another anonymous source, Disney actually did threaten EA on the exclusivity deal, and while we don't know for sure how legitimate that source is, everything is kind of pointing towards one picture here. And one thing we must remember is that in 2006, after a 10-year partnership, Disney did not renew its cross-promotional pact with McDonald's. That deal was said to be worth $1 billion for Disney, but Disney did not want to be associated with childhood obesity. So it's pretty clear that Disney will not tolerate an association with childhood gambling. The pressure is on EA. The noise we've been making has been seeing results. First, those epic star cards were removed from loot boxes way back. Then more recently, they reduced the hero costs. Then they did the Ask Me Anything. Now they've temporarily disabled microtransactions. EA keeps ceding territory to us the more we fight them. Think of how much more could be done the more we fight. Pay to win could be eliminated from Battlefront 2 altogether. In fact, according to an article from VentureBeat, during development, at some point, Battlefront 2 had a monetization model very similar to Overwatch's, cosmetic only. Quote, it would have favored cosmetic items like hero costumes in its loot boxes over perks and weapons. Most of these ideas were dropped from Battlefront 2, at least in part, to a request from Disney's Star Wars division Lucasfilm. So given this system was on the table at some point, that means they probably still have some assets something, some kind of structure of that from back then. And if we establish that the pay-to-win model is unacceptable, the loot box model is unacceptable, we can fight them all the way back to that. Now, a big part of EA's damage control tactics were to ensure that the game would still sell. And for a AAA developer, a big part of that is their Metacritic score. AAA devs want at minimum an 8 out of 10, ideally a 9 out of 10. Because to the public at large, anything below an 8 out of 10 is just a terrible game. Well, the reviews have been coming in, and it seems a common criticism is the loot box microtransaction system. A lot of outlets are taking off big points just because of that. Ars Technica's review verdict is, avoid Star Wars Battlefront 2. In Giant Bomb's review, the reviewer stated, I'd usually get a paltry amount of credits, or an emote, for a character or class I never played as. At no point did I feel like I was making any progress towards directly improving anything I use. I'd just grind and grind until I had enough to buy a loot box, then get disappointed by its contents, and repeat the cycle again. 2 out of 5 stars. Polygon outright called the game pay to win and gave it a 7 out of 10. PC Gamer's review stated, to facilitate microtransactions, progression is slow, overcomplicated, and unfun, and gave it a 63 out of 100. Slant Magazine's review called the game a soulless pachinko machine where narrative depth, cooperation between friends, and the exhilaration of gameplay have all taken a backseat to the gaping Sarlacc-like maw of unadulterated greed. The review later states, the game is notoriously stingy about letting you play with the people you want, and as the characters you most desire, but giving EA your credit card number has never been easier. 2 out of 5 stars. Game Informer gave the game a 6.5 out of 10. Digital Trends gave it a 7 out of 10. IGN gave it a 6.5 out of 10. IGN! And in their advertising for the game, EA actually pulled a line from IGN's review. Feels like you're in a Star Wars movie. Normally they would include the IGN score after that, but no, they're not proud of that one. GameSpot gave it a 6 out of 10, Shack News gave it a 6 out of 10, Forbes gave it a 5 out of 10, Destructoid gave it a 5 out of 10. As of right now, the game's Metacritic score is 67 out of 100, and the user score, a 0.8 out of 10. And that's despite Metacritic deleting a ton of user reviews. And it seems all the bad reviews, all the bad press is impacting sales, EA's bottom line, ultimately all they really care about. In the UK, physical copies of Battlefront 2 are down 60% compared to Battlefront 1, which released 2 years ago. Now you can argue, well, most people buy games digitally nowadays, but that can't explain a 60% drop over just 2 years. Maybe if it was 10 years ago. And according to GameIndustry.biz publisher Christopher Dring, EA estimates that 36% of sales are digital versus only 10 to 15% 2 years ago. He says, quote, even if the numbers are higher for the UK market, you're still looking at a hefty decline. He goes on to say that some of the slippage is definitely attributed to the rise of digital sales, but he says you're probably looking at a decline of 30% perhaps with digital factored in. Because we have to remember that it's mostly the PC market that is primarily digital. Console is still very much physical copies. And for Battlefront 2, 55% of sales were on PS4, 44% were on Xbox One, and only 1% of Battlefront 2 sales were on PC. Call of Duty World War II, which released November 3rd, retained its spot as the #1 seller of the week, when you would normally expect a new release like Battlefront 2 to take that spot. Now again, we're talking about UK physical copies here, but that's just a microcosm for the greater world. Before the game even released, investment sites started to caution against investing in EA stock, given the controversy around Battlefront 2. According to InvestorPlace.com, quote, Battlefront 2 was the reason to buy EA stock this holiday season. That isn't the case anymore. In fact, Battlefront 2 might actually now be a reason to sell EA stock. And if you look at the stock, starting on November 16th, the stock started dropping. It stabilized after hitting a low on Monday, but EA stock is down 7% month to date through last Thursday. Now, despite this, EA issued a securities filing last Friday revolving around its decision to suspend in-game purchases in Battlefront 2. And the company said, quote, this change is not expected to have a material impact on EA's fiscal year 2018 financial guidance. In other words, whatever their profit they were projecting for the year, they're saying that there's not going to be any significant change to this based on them turning off microtransactions. And a big part of that is probably because they intend to put them back in. Now, as much as I'd love to see it as a victory that EA took a 7% hit to its stock, one thing to bear in mind is that year over year, EA stock is up 38%. And a big part of this is thanks to their microtransactions. For 2017, EA's total digital net revenue was $2.87 billion. And $1.68 billion of that, that's almost 60% of that, was from microtransactions alone. $800 million, almost 30% of the 2.87, was from FIFA microtransactions alone. So while it is important to fight this battle to save this one game from microtransactions, what we must keep in mind is that we're fighting a greater war over the future of the monetization of the industry. We don't just want this system to not be in Battlefront 2, we don't want this in any game ever again. And with government agencies now starting to step in and start to evaluate whether or not we need to regulate games with loot boxes, it seems that EA will potentially have ruined a revenue stream for all developers everywhere. All because, like the dwarves of Moria, they got too greedy. So that wraps up this massive video. I wish I could have made this shorter, but there's just so much to cover. And this is such an important topic. But if there's one thing to take away from this, folks, it's that we've been making a difference. We're making progress, and we have to continue. And also, please save net neutrality. And that wraps up this video. Thanks for watching. Special thanks to my Twitch and Patreon supporters for making these videos possible. If you enjoyed this video, please share it, check out these other videos, and subscribe to join Rhykkers Raiders for more gaming content.